Afternoon. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. My name is Debra Magpie Earling. I'm the new director of the Creative Writing Program, and I am so excited to be here today. I am thrilled with fairy tales and new ways of writing. I'm thrilled with speculative fiction. Just so happy to be here and honored and thrilled to introduce our two very powerful and astonishing women. So I'm going to introduce Lily Hoang first. Lily Hoang is the author of 4 books: Unfinished, The Evolutionary Revolution, Changing, which was the recipient of a Pen Beyond Margins Award, and Parabola, winner of the 2006 Chiasmus Press Undoing the Novel Contest. With Blake Butler, she edited the anthology 30 Under 30, an anthology of innovative fiction by young writers. Hoang serves as co-editor at Puerto del Sol, editor at Tarpaulin Sky, and associate editor at Starcher Books. Publishers Weekly describes Hoang's A Bestiary as a genre-transcending work. Hoang relentlessly teases apart mythology, familial memory, and investigative essay into searing fragments, then weaves them into a dazzling swarm. Hoang models her post-colonial bestiary on the Chinese zodiac: a pack of dogs, a swarm of insects, a mischief of rats. You desire the human equivalent, and uses it to represent such concepts as fidelity, beauty, and the disgust of desire. Hoang is one of only 11 writers whose syllabus was included in Emily Temple's article, "I urge you to drop E6702, Course Syllabi by Famous Authors," in the Atlantic Monthly. Famous writers' syllabi also included David Foster Wallace, Donald Barthelme, and Auden. I include a brief excerpt from her graduate workshop syllabus here. No one here needs to worry about grades. Unless you don't come to class, don't do your work, or don't talk. She also invokes a cookie policy. Cookie policy: if your cell phone rings or buzzes, you will bring cookies for everyone. If I catch you texting, the same. Please welcome Lily Hoang.
Yes, I'm turning off the vibrate so that it doesn't make any sound. Oh, it's already. I've never read with a microphone while holding it. So I'm going to try it without. Can everybody hear me? Great. It's such a pleasure to be here in Montana, and what a lovely place. My first time here, and embarrassingly, I didn't know that Montana borders Canada, despite the fact that I was once getting a PhD in geography. So Kate and I would like to thank the Dana Gallery and Debra for hosting, and Rachel Mendel for this great book festival. And so I'll just start. I'm going to read a chapter from a bestiary, and it's called On Catastrophe, and I think that's all you need to know, that it's catastrophic. Oh, and it's very important that you know that I call this an essay, and that this is non-fiction. And you'll see why in a minute. On Catastrophe. When he left, he said, "I love you." He hugged me from the passenger seat and got onto a plane that took him to a bus that crossed into Canada. Across the border, our old friends were waiting to drive him back to Kingston. I didn't release my seatbelt, but our embrace was not without warmth. It contained 8 years, and I didn't even get out of the car. 8 years was long enough. I cried during the 45-minute drive home. I texted Dorothy, "Chris left." I texted Dorothy again. I just took him to the airport. And this is not a joke. LOL, not LOL. Still in awe, I went to Dorothy's house, and there we celebrated the end of a terrible relationship. Because this is how it all ends, with brutal resentment. My dead sister's life became a catastrophe, and then she died, and she passed the baton of destruction to her oldest son, Justin. She gave him her addiction and her confidence gain, and they both had their skin rubbed clean, wore Texas Department of Corrections uniforms, were assigned an inmate number. They both served their time. Justin has been in and out of jail and prison and rehab for felons since his mother died. It's been nearly 3 years. It's like it's become normal or something, he says to me. Man, that shit should never be normal. This time he's kicked the brown and his attitude is bright. Tomorrow he's moving back in with me. I wanted to be a good wife, and for the most part, I was. But the fact that my marriage was a catastrophe doesn't change. Nor was it entirely my ex-husband's fault, but yes, he was crazy and violent and abusive, and then it was over. Inside his dead mother's Gucci fanny pack, among the debris and trash just and abandoned in my room after the first time he left New Mexico because he couldn't score, I found used syringes, a bent spoon. The whole room smelled of burning. If I had given him my room and I slept in my study, because my selflessness is a flaw I inherited from my mother, I suffered very well. He's been gone nearly 4 years now, and we are divorced, and now I pay him alimony. When he left, he said, I love you, and if I need it, can you help me out? I said yes. I thought, I'll say anything, please, just go. Then came the day he wanted to make it legal, stipulated, and he doesn't claim his trust fund in the paperwork, and I don't mention it either. He's an anarchist, radically ethical, a feminist. He cares about indigenous rights. His dissertation, if he ever finishes it, is on utopias. And here I thought he'd have more integrity than to take money from a woman of color. He calls it feminism. Dorothy texts, LOL, hashtag anarchist alimony. She's talking about the book I need to write, my memoir. After his first battle rap, we're hotboxing my car with a friend this day. Justin tells the stranger, she's kind of like my mom now. Weeks later, he says to me, I want a family, white brick fence or whatever. Don't you want to be a grandmother? Chris forced me to be more responsible, more adult, to take care of him. Stability, I learned, is necessitated by fear. Weeks when even my cat is too much responsibility for me. Mother to a 24-year-old with addiction and a dead mother, we are all damaged. In his lyrics, I recognize myself. When I was a wife, I ate 3 meals a day. We ate organic everything. Chris thought salt was unhealthy, so we took our food unseasoned. Now I eat once a day to lose weight, and somehow I'm healthier. Or at least I'm happier. Responsibility, health, double knotting the laces of your boots before pulling. Once there is a village, and it is very peaceful. The people in the village are happy, and every night there would be a dance in the town square where children would run rosy circles and teenagers would sneak quick wet kisses when adults turned their heads. But menace lurks just beyond these poorly fortified walls. One morning, the villagers rise with the sun as they always do and walk out to greet each other as they always do. And in the middle of the town square is a body, and it was lifeless. The throat had been ripped open, as if by massive jowls. The next morning, another body, and another. Finally, after 10 moons have crested and fallen, a brave man steps forward, and it is decided that he will venture into the forest without fear and capture the white tiger who did this. But how did they know the tiger was white? The brave man has a family, and he kisses them goodbye, promising a swift return and a new tiger skin blanket to keep them warm during the winter snows. Shh, he whispers to his wife, I'm the best marksman in the village. He puts a large hand around the base of her neck and pulls her forward in a farewell kiss. She looks away afterwards, as if in embarrassment for the love she feels. And you, the man says to his infant son, you are the man of the house now. Do you know what that means? But the boy does not. The brave man laughs, gives the boy a quick pet, and leaves. He never returns, but the white tiger stops killing villagers. And so everyone forgets, except the boy and his widowed mother. Many years later, the boy becomes a young man. His whole life he is trained for only one task, to kill the white tiger who killed his father. Every year on his birthday, the young man asks his mother for permission to hunt the tiger who killed his father, and every year his mother does not allow it. Finally, on the morning of his 15th birthday, the young man pleads, and there is one cadence to his voice that his mother remembers from infancy. Would it be different, she wonders, if he had actually had a father? Your father, she says, could shoot a tin can filled with water off my head from a mile away and not spill a drop. The young man fills a tin can with water, places it on his mother's head, paces out a mile and turns around. His eyes are clear and his aim is taut, but he misses the can entirely. Recognizing his error, he begins to train again. For 3 years, the young man works and he struggles, and then he says to his mother, "I am ready." Again, he fills a tin can with water and places it on her head. Again, he paces out a mile and turns around. This time, he takes a breath. He points the gun and shoots. Over lunch, the mother says, "I am so proud of you, son. Your father would be too. Your skill has nearly met his." The rice she has cooked is perfect, not too sticky, not too dry. She squeezes a wad of it into a tight ball and pops it into her mouth. "Your father," she says, "used to be able to shoot the eye out of a needle from a mile away." She shakes her head. "I wouldn't expect you to be able to do that, though. But if the white tiger ate your father, he will surely eat you too." Mother and son go outside. He places a sewing needle against a tree trunk and paces a mile out. He shoots and completely misses, barely makes contact with the tree itself, which, to be fair, is rather thin. For 3 years, the young man works and he struggles. Then he says to his mother, "I am ready." Again, he places a sewing needle against a tree trunk. Again, he paces a mile out and turns around. This time, he takes a breath. He points the gun and shoots. The mother looks at the needle. Its eye is perfectly gone. She is joyful and distraught. You see, the boy's father was an excellent marksman, but he never performed these impossible feats. She made them all up. She had hoped that she had derived such unreasonable tasks that he would recognize his folly and never leave, but alas, she must admit, it is time. So drastic is the shift in Justin that he seems to have drifted out of the pages of Ovid. There was a time before when the pupils in his eyes were plugged with evil, heroin eyes. They were shiny and vast, oceanic, sublime. And now those same eyes are gentle and caring. He cries from those eyes when his family is cruel to him. He calls me and is no longer ashamed to weep. Catastrophic or not, we reach the same conclusion. Chris is gone and I am okay. Now. I've never been a news person, too much catastrophe, or I just don't care about anything other than myself. But not all stories must end how mine did with Chris. Some stories really do offer ever afters brimming with happiness. A year ago, I was still paying Chris alimony. He wrote me an email entailing all the reasons I should take him back. He suggested long-distance polyamory. I then understood the function of alimony. I was paying him not to be in my life. Justin and I were never close. I don't interact well with children. By the time I could find a language that might have opened up our communication, he was a brooding, angry teenager. He didn't want to hang out with his nerd aunt, and I couldn't blame him. I assumed I would never have a relationship with my nephew, and I was more or less fine with that. He'd grown into a thug with low-hanging pants and gangsta signs. I didn't know him at all. I would take a million more black eyes and public bruises than the vitriol of Chris's manipulative and demonic words. They wielded power over me. I believed their heinousness, and sometimes, when I am least suspecting, the insecurity he drove into me still rises up to my skin in oil, and I break out often. When Chris emails me, he says he's gone through a lot of therapy and all of his issues are under control now. His privilege, white and all the others too, is mighty. I wish I had that brand of confidence. Instead, I just don't reply. The young man travels through the village and into the forest and out of the forest and into another village. It sits inside a copse of trees and the white tiger is known to live just beyond. The village is very small and the man makes his way to its only inn. The innkeeper is a gentle old crone, and upon her very first glance at this young man knew immediately that he was the son of another young, handsome man who many years before had crossed this very same threshold, looking for a warm room and a cold ale. Many men have traveled here before you, she says. She says you are not the first to go hunting the white tiger. The inn is humble but not tragic. The thatched roof barely leaks, and all of the glasses are clean. They shine. Once there was a young man who you resembled greatly, and he was the best marksman I have seen. Why, he could shoot a grain of salt from a distance of 3 miles, and he did not survive the white tiger. Surely, you can't do this. The innkeeper and the young man go outside. He places a single grain of salt on a tree trunk, paces 3 miles, and turns around. He shoots and completely misses. The young man asks the innkeeper for a roof. For 3 years, the young man works and struggles, and now he is a man. Then he says to the innkeeper, I am ready. This time, he takes a breath. He points the gun and shoots. Splendid, the innkeeper shouts. It is a beautiful day. Sunshine slates the scene with hope. But, she says, I remember he also used to shoot a shot so soft it could split a single strand of my hair right on my head and still have the strand remain intact. The man is tired. For years now, he has worked, and he has worked, and he has struggled. And finally, he says to the innkeeper, I'm ready. This time, the first time, he fires, and the shot is so soft that it divides a single strand of her hair without removing it from her head. She sighs and shakes her head. These feats, she told the boy she remembered his father doing, well, she made them up. For she did not want to see another young man fall prey to the white tiger, but still, she says, it is time. The man makes his way through the forest. The brush is dense, and he has a good number of cuts along his arms and legs, but he is diligent. He will catch this white tiger, this ghost. Although there are no roads or paths, an old crone crosses his way. She is frail and very hungry. The man shares a rice cake with her. This is a dangerous place, and there is only one reason you might be here. She shakes her head. Turn around. Go back. You will die in the jaws of the white tiger. I promise you. Seeing her hunger, the man gives her another rice cake, and she continues, the white tiger is as cruel as lightning and just as fast. If you see him, you will already be dead. To kill the white tiger, you must catch him from very far away. All you will see is a white dot. The moment you can discern that it is in fact a white tiger, you may as well slit your own throat. That's how dead you will already be. She shoves the last of the rice ball into her mouth and leaves. The man sits quietly for many hours. He looks into the distance and plots a map of the mountains and land. He memorizes each fold in the earth, each protrusion. He sits this way for many more hours. Soon he has sat there for days and weeks, and he is studying. One day, far in the distance, there is a change. There is a slow movement, a white dot raised against a geography he has blacked into his mind. He raises his pistol, closes one steady eye, takes a breath, and shoots. The landscape becomes stationary once again. Once, pushing her thumb against the kitchen table, Chris's grandmother had said, sometimes a husband dies, and she lifted her thumb, and the widow just blossoms. Her hands shot out to indicate a bursting forth. The other day, over milkshakes, my friend Thomas tells me he had an encounter with Chris. He indicates the square quotes with his finger. In my head, I'm freaking out that maybe he's come back into town, and what if he tries to see me, and what if he comes by the house, and what will he do? It's not that I'm scared for my safety, but I am. Chris, it turns out, started following him on Instagram. I think it's to see if there are pictures of you on my Instagram, Thomas says, and there are, a lot. I push at my lemon pie milkshake. It's late summer, but the evenings in the desert are cool. There's a strong wind, and it blows the napkins off our table. So I clicked on his Instagram. Thomas is silent for a minute, waiting for me to react. There's a childishness to him, an eagerness to please. Relieving him, I say, and what'd you find? Mostly just pictures of him and his parents. Wait, unless he's just hanging out with old people who look like his parents. Are they fat and big and miserable looking? Yes, those are his parents. Oh, and there's one with him next to a sports car, pretending like it's his. Thomas, like all of my friends, hates Chris. They remember the way he devastated me, not in his departure, but during his presence. Chris doesn't have a sports car. Do you want to see them? Thomas pats his pocket. Shit, it's charging in the car. I don't want to see the pictures. I don't want to see Chris, even if picture is too close. My friend Dylan says, what's the catastrophe today, Lily? Later in the car, Thomas pulls out his phone and starts jabbing at the screen. Weird, he says. He says, what other screen name would he use? He's not under Chris. He controls the screen by moving his index finger up and down. When he lifts his finger, I see the colors carousel like lace tracers. I knew it. What? He just added me to see your pictures. He's not following me anymore. Why would he add you on Instagram just to look for pictures of me when he can just Google image me? Duh. Thomas has a way of inflecting tone that perfectly matches his emotion. It's aggravating and endearing. It's not exciting. And I agree, it's not. The man walks a distance of 5 miles to reach the white tiger. It is a large beast, and its white is unadulterated. He touches it. Its fur is subdued against the enormity of the thing itself. As his hand passes his rib, he feels a knocking. Then he hears cries for help, muffled and distant and clearly distressed. He opens the white tiger's mouth and climbs in. Inside, it is wet and dark, and there is only one clear path, and so the man makes his way to the white tiger's belly. By the time the man reaches an opening, he is fully soaked in mucus and blood. A beautiful girl runs towards him. She is stunning in that way that silences a man. You've saved me. You've saved me. She throws herself into his chest. What's this? A voice calls from a dark crevice. Are we saved? The man whose voice had just called stands up. He uses the white tiger's intestinal lining for support. He is not old, but he is not so young anymore either. The man who used to be a boy looks at this other man and sees in him a resemblance so keen as to be unmistakable. Yes, this was his father. The two embrace with the warmth of a sun flare. The son returns his father to their home, and when his mother sees their approach, her screams contain uncontainable delight. Over dinner, his mother learns that the beautiful girl is the daughter of the king's highest counselor, and tomorrow the son must bring her to the palace to reunite their family. The son rarely returns to his house in the village now that he is married to the beautiful girl. The king, seeing in the man a bravery and skill unmatched by any before him, makes him commander of the army. They are terribly happy, to this very day. As for the man and his wife, tonight they sleep under the warmest white tiger fur blankets in all the land. I am Justin's only family now. I was not some victim, though. Our relationship was a map of hurt, and its scale was strictly emotional. Once, the tiger's wife became very ill. Although they lived in the wild, the tiger traveled through many lands to find a doctor who would treat his wife. Treat my wife, the tiger says, and I will not eat you. Many times he has been forced to eat the doctor. And the tiger's wife becomes more and more ill until she dies. The tiger was forlorn. He gathered kindling in his mouth, and the splinters arched into his gums and tongue, but he pressed on. Her funeral pyre was blazing. Taken with grief, the tiger joined his wife in silence. There were no grand trumpets, no cries of despair. Real sadness does not need a performance. He placed his body around hers, holding her gently amidst wild waves of fire. And in the smolder of morning, the wind flitted away swirls of ashy particles, and an incandescent white tiger stepped forward.
Kate Bernheimer has been called the living master of the fairy tale. Her most recent book, Opposite Night, style. Bernheimer taps into the poetry of fairy tales to reveal the dread that seeps into ordinary things, as well as the redemptive power of language and story. Please welcome. I'll go about the mic too, is that
projecting fine. Thank you for that beautiful introduction, and really it was such a pleasure to hear you read that. I don't know if we've ever done a reading together.
I don't think
We've
we have.
known each other since 2005.
Yeah.
And thank you all for coming out. It's such a great space for a fairy tale reading. To see the woods and
Those were the woods that I was talking about.
That's great. And I'm not going to read a story that, well, I don't know, this one first have woods in it, but you can imagine the woods. I'm going to start just by reading a translation into English of a Russian fairy tale so that we can sort of get into the old mood of fairy tales in their affect. And yet also, although I think that you set the stage for this, on to the notion that fairy tales aren't princess gets married stories, nor are they easy celebrations of passivity, as common stereotypes hold. They're very much resistance stories, some of them. Some of them are very much fascist stories, but they do represent resistance to all kinds of abuses and domination attempts and successes. So I just wanted to read you an old fairy tale that you might not know. It wasn't made into a Disney movie, and nor was it on Saturday morning cartoons. But this is called How a Husband Weaned His Wife from Fairy Tales, and it's a story. I take the title of my new story collection from How a Mother Weaned Her Girl from Fairy Tales. But this is from the Angela Carter anthology called the Virago Book of Fairy Tales, The Moana the Prince, and we should certainly bring it back. Amazing book. How a Husband Weaned His Wife from Fairy Tales. And I chose it for you in part because there's an innkeeper. So, there was once an innkeeper whose wife loved fairy tales above all else and accepted as lodgers only those who could tell stories. Of course, the husband suffered loss because of this, and he wondered how he could wean his wife away from fairy tales. One night in winter, at a late hour, an old man shivering with cold asked him for shelter. The husband ran out and said, "Can you tell stories? My wife does not allow me to let anyone in who cannot tell stories." The old man saw that he had no choice. He was almost frozen to death. He said, "I can tell stories. And will you tell them for a long time?" "All night." So far, so good. They let the old man in. The husband said, "Wife, this peasant has promised to tell stories all night long, but only on condition that you do not argue with him or interrupt him." The old man said, "Yes, there must be no interruptions or I will not tell him the stories." They ate supper and went to bed. Then the old man began. An owl flew by a garden, sat on a tree trunk, and drank some water. An owl flew into a garden, sat on a tree trunk, and drank some water. He kept on saying again and again, an owl flew into a garden, sat on a tree trunk, and drank some water. The wife listened and listened and then said, "What kind of story is this? He keeps repeating the same thing over and over. Why do you interrupt me? I told you not to argue with me. That was only the beginning. It was going to change later." The husband, upon hearing this, and it was exactly what he wanted to hear, jumped down from his bed and began to belabor his wife. "You were told not to argue, and now you would not let him finish his story." And he thrashed her, so that she began to hate stories, and from that time on, forswore listening to them. Such a happy ending. So heartwarming.
Yeah.
So lovely. More fairy tales end, if you look at the millions, well, I can't remember the millions, but the thousands of versions around the world. More fairy tales end in catastrophe than in happiness, although sometimes they'll end on a happy word or a beautiful word, and thus we get that feeling. I'm going to read you a story called The Punk's Bride. It's only about 11 minutes long. And it's based on a Grimm's fairy tale you might know called The Hare Bride. And in that story, which is just about a paragraph long, the one I just read you, a rabbit persuades a young girl, to marry him, though she doesn't really want to, and things go very badly from it. For both of them, in different ways. It's a tragic tale, and it's very short. But this story is called The Punk's Bride, and just as you felt it was very important to point out that your story was nonfiction, I'm just going to have a little disclaimer. This is fiction. It's all invented, all made up, none of it ever happened. So, The Punk's Bride. There was once a woman and her daughter, and the daughter kept a beautiful garden with cabbages, daisies, etc. The daughter was in her early 20s and lived at home. She was a secretary and couldn't afford her own place, and she didn't want to move in with some friends who had asked her. Their apartment always was dirty, and there were different guys over most nights. The daughter wasn't a prude, but she got nervous about the idea she wouldn't know who was there when she was sleeping. The mother also was nervous and didn't like her daughter to go out at night, but sometimes the girl went out to the bar. It was on the same block as their little house. Actually, it was next door. It used to be a convenience store, but it had been turned into a bar. When the daughter went to the bar and sat on the back patio to smoke, her mother sat on their back patio too. They had conversations through the chain link fence. One bar regular was an attractive guy in a punk band. It was a good band, and he wore tiny hoop earrings. One night after hours, he leaned over their fence and picked the daisies. The mother said to her daughter, "Can you go up front and ask that punk to move on? It's frightening me." The girl stood behind the screen door of her house and said, "My mother wants you to leave." It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The mother and daughter were light sleepers and usually dozed in the front room on the couch instead of going to bed. They left the TV on all night and played Mexican soap operas. These were like lullabies to them. The guy said, "Come hear my band play. We're playing at EJ's tomorrow. It's across from Bar 22. I'll put you on the list." At Bar 22, the lights were always too bright. They had red velvet boots and dollar whiskey cokes. It wasn't a cool bar, and the girl liked it there. She also liked EJ's, which always smelled bad, like vomit, or good, like cocaine. The girl preferred unpopular places, which is why she almost never went out. There were hardly any unpopular places left anymore. It was strange and disappointing how popular the world had become. So she didn't go hear the punk's band. The next night, he showed up again around the same time and started to sing to the flowers a song about life on Mars. The woman said to her daughter, "Please, I'm begging you, just get him to leave." The girl went out beyond the screen door. "I don't know what's her problem," she said. She wore a pair of men's underwear and a black t-shirt with a white unicorn on it. The musician said, "Just get in the back of my bike and we'll go to my house and listen to records." He gestured toward his 3-speed. It was white and rusted and had a kickstand. It had a Gordon Lightfoot bumper sticker on it, and one of the tires was flat. She shook her head shyly and went back inside. On the 3rd day, the guy leaned over the gate and held his hands clasped together like he was praying. He wore contact lenses, one brown and one blue. "Jean," the mother said. "Jean." Jean went outdoors and said, "Can you, pick another garden to haunt? We just happen to live next door to the bar. It isn't my fault." "Jean, don't be such a scare baby. Come over. You know you like me. You know that you're wild. Why are you always hiding in fear?" So she went and they listened to records. They got drunk on tequila, the kind that comes in a glass skull. The next day she made him breakfast, then lunch, then supper. They drank more tequila from skulls. After a few years like this, he said, "They should get married." Who were the wedding guests? I can tell you this because someone told me. They were all musicians, except for the house painters, and they were all friends of the boys, except for the one who was head secretary of Jean's place of employment. She lived on a houseboat with her husband, who also was there. They were both very small. A bartender from the bar that was next door to her mother's house served as the minister, and the altar was a hydrangea in the front yard. The wedding party went into the wee hours, which Jean used to enjoy with her mother in front of the television, but for years had spent by herself while her boyfriend, now husband, was out at the bars and also with girls. Later on, during the party, the husband was in the backyard with some wedding guests and a lot of others who'd heard there was a party. Twins who were strippers, a famous musician wearing pajamas, a couple of very old men, people like that. Quite a few girls who had slept with her boyfriend, now husband. Jean watched through the back door as her husband smoked one cigarette after another until he'd smoked maybe 2 packs. He was skinny, and his hair stood straight up, like a drawing of some German fairy tale guy she'd seen in a book. Shock-headed Peter. That boy was crazy. That was a very good book. Jean could smell her husband through the walls. He was that kind of guy. Never washed, but it worked wonders on him. You kind of expect that in musicians, but this was different. This was out of this world. He was the only guy she'd ever been with, the only guy she'd ever lived with. The husband came up to the screen door to the kitchen. He banged his fist on it. He yelled, "Jean, get the F out here. Everyone thinks you're being crazy. You never act like you love me. You're such a loser. I thought you were cooler than this." Maybe he saw her crying in the kitchen, or maybe he didn't. He probably did. He went back to the party. At one point, another musician came in and kissed Jean, and she forgot her troubles for a few moments, but soon he pushed her away and leaned on the counter and threw up in the sink. It's possible another musician came in later on and also threw up in the sink. And you might wonder if a third one came in and effed Jean in the bathroom. We never will know. And so it continues. As is the habit in stories, daylight arrived. The sunrise was pink, sparkling, fogged. Her husband came once more to the screen and said in a very warm, loving tone, "Jean, dude, make us some breakfast. We're starving, man." He wasn't a bad person. He could be very kind. How the hell do you think Jean would have been with him otherwise, right? Believe what you want. Believe fairy tales, because then his voice changed. "Jesus, Jean, what the F? Where the hell are you? What the F's wrong with you, man?" Jean was sitting on the kitchen floor in her underwear, that old unicorn t-shirt. When she didn't answer, he started yelling, "F you, Jean, F you. You aren't any fun. You never were fun. You ruined my life, you F-er bitch." After a while, the yelling stopped. It was pretty much silent. The party moved somewhere else. Jean slumped there a while, but not for too long. Soon, she went into the bedroom and found a doll she bought at the thrift shop. Not her usual thing, buying stuff she didn't need for decorative or emotional reasons. She preferred to live in abstraction, in love and in sadness. In stories, you know. Yet, she liked the doll. It was a nondescript doll, made of straw. The doll resembled a rabbit, but wasn't a rabbit. The doll was a girl. A lot of things are like other things. A lot of things are interchangeable, especially girls. Jean dressed the straw doll in some of her own clothes, a tank top with David Bowie's face silhouetted on it, a pair of sequin hot pants, knee-high leather boots. She gave the doll a nice old-fashioned stirring spoon, wooden, and stood the doll next to the stove in the kitchen. Then Jean packed a suitcase. She took all the Gordon Lightfoot records, the tequila, and her favorite jackknife, and walked out the door. She was 47 years old. She took the bus to her mother's, yes, wearing underpants and a unicorn t-shirt. It was that kind of city, nobody minded. That evening, her husband came home. He opened the front door by kicking it in, and when he entered the kitchen, he careened from one side of the room to the other, and then finally landed, wavering on his feet by the sink, where the doll stood. He gaped at the doll. She held the wooden spoon in the air, but there was nothing to stir. He leaned in, like he was going to kiss the doll. He had the most unusual look in his eyes. It's hard to describe. It was either fear or desire. And then he struck the doll hard on the head with his hand. It sailed right through the straw. Needless to say, the doll lost her mind then. And that's when the husband realized she wasn't his bride. Actually, Jean didn't go back to her mother. And there wasn't any straw doll. That was from a great little story Jean never even had read. A story about rabbits, talking rabbits. Rabbits marrying girls. I mean, can you believe that? Do you even like that kind of story? Maybe I do, but I'm not myself anymore. As far as I can tell, and now I'm a rabbit. Rabbit covered in fur. Do my ears look big to you? Does my nose tremble? You know, I used to be frozen in fear, but that story's over, except there are new fears. Isn't that the way that it goes? So hop, hop, here I go now. Guess I'll be getting a drink. Maybe something served in the skull. I mean, even rabbits like sipping tequila. Do you happen to have any tequila? Seriously, do you have anything for me? Probably not. The end. I just want to thank the Notre Dame Review, because this is being recorded, right? Thank you to the Notre Dame Review for publishing that story in their list of sections.
I wanted to talk about, well, I wanted you to talk about your creative process and, how do you go about finding your stories and expressing them?
Yeah, I think you have more
I just read. My writing comes entirely out of reading, and I read, devour fairy tales day in and day out in fairy tale scholarship and all kinds of philosophy and other literature as well. But I always start a new story by reading variations of a traditional fairy tale, by which I mean a story probably published 150 or more years ago in English language translation. And I read and read and read and read around the tale, and then my process is, if what you mean is process, I find a story, something ignites my imagination. I think of a character or a situation. I was thinking of a very specific character and situation when I wrote The Punk's Bride, and I also had just read a great Roddy Doyle book, The Woman Who Walked Through Walls. So good. A friend of mine, the great writer Willie Block, had just written it for me, and I was thinking a lot about domination, abuse, and survival. So I find a story, and then, as with this story, I prop up a fairy tale book on my desk, and I start transcribing, because I think of my work very much as like translation and imitation. And I just go in to the woods of the story and see where it takes me. But that's just like a story about writing a story, right? Because really a lot of it is just drudgery. A lot of it is just like hours at the desk writing anything that I can think of and trying to work my way around into a novel or story. So there's that too. But when it comes to fairy tales, I think very much about it as a kind of translation story into a story. And Angela Carter described it as an imitation. And that's what David Bowie talks about. He talked about, it's hard not to talk about him in the present tense, I'm sorry. He said he wasn't a rock and roller, he was an artist, and rock and roll was his medium. So I think that's the way a lot of artists think about composition. Those of you here, so many artists in this room, working, copying, imitating, forming.
Really, I love that phrase, into the woods. They go into the woods to get my story. What woods do you enter, Lily?
None, but except for the ones that my characters enter. But when I teach, I often tell my students that writing is 50% science and 50% mystic. So, and I think that another way of putting that is, I live half of my life in toil and half of my life in marble. And so I think that has a lot to do with process. So there's a science to writing, right? There are craft things. You can learn pacing, you can learn place, you can learn all of these things. But when it comes down to it, these are only things that you're accessing later during the actual process. There's a really great, I know I shouldn't say like TED Talk, but I was listening to a TED Talk the other day on creativity. And this guy from some Ivy League school put a number of jazz pianists into an fMRI machine and watched them create. And what he saw was that a big portion of the prefrontal cortex shut down, the part that controls self-control. The part that tells you to shut the fuck up because you're being a fool and you should not do this. But then another part lights up, and that's the part that controls autobiography. And so that turns on. And so in many ways, writing is that process where creativity is that process where you can't be afraid of messing up and making a big mess, right? But you also have to know the rules in order to mess them up. So that's my process.
I'm of the mind that everyone has a particular fascination. And if they find out what that fascination is, if they really acknowledge and accept that, you're more than halfway there to really developing and finding your stories. Do you have a fascination, like you're on the Windsor Common or Cabinet of Curiosities that things that fascinate and, stories that you collect and bits of things that, inspire you?
Kate Bernheimer inspired me.
I'm allowed to do that.
But no, when I read The Complete Tales of Ketsi and Gold, I was a graduate student at Notre Dame. And my mind was blown. I didn't know that books could do that. I didn't know that you could write fairy tales. I didn't know any of these things. And so Kate, it all started with you, but it started before that too. I grew up watching Chinese soap operas, which are magic, right? So people ask me why I'm interested in fairy tales, and I'll say, oh, well, you know, the Grimms and Hans Christian Andersen. But no, it actually isn't that. It's that I grew up thinking people could fly, and that women slept on ropes, just suspended in the air, and that you could touch someone and they would freeze until you touched them again in a different spot on their body. Just they would freeze. So, and that you could walk into a labyrinth and it would move around. Like, this is the world that I thought was the normal world. And it wasn't until, I think the day before yesterday, when someone was like, you watched that growing up? No wonder you're so weird, Lily. It's like, yeah, no, that was my normal. So.
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of the Eric Fromm book. I don't know if you guys have heard from The Forgotten Language. He writes about how in the fairy tale as in the dream, there is no as if. It just is real. What's happening is what's real, just as in reality. Yeah. We think what's happening is real. You know, maybe we're just dreaming this. But
it's possible.
You know, so that was real to you in childhood. I grew up watching fairy tales as well. My grandfather was a publicist for Warner and Disney and promoted movies and records to Boston radio shows and television programs and did the premieres. And so he had this was before DVDs or before any live streaming or even before VHS or Beta. I don't know. I don't remember what all the technology was when I was a kid. It was before all that. He had a projector in his basement and movie seats. It was dinky. It wasn't fancy. And he would check out the movies from this warehouse. It was called the Vault. And he would bring the Disney movies home and show them in his basement. And those movies are really terrifying. And they're not, people talk about Disney as sanitized, but they're not. They're really terrifying. And I think it's sensory overload down there. It was very enchanting and very terrifying at the same time. And combine that with all kinds of family drama / trauma, you get a real confused sense about what is real and what isn't real. But I think that what became my infatuation, or I think the word you used was obsession.
I think it is an obsession.
Yeah.
It is.
It was with storytelling, really, and sort of like the ownership. Who's telling the story? Whose story is it? And who's going to get out alive? And fairy tales fed right into that. So once I started reading fairy tales, I really just couldn't stop. And it's a strange thing. It's been identified as a kind of affliction. Like, if we start studying fairy tales, that you get actually obsessed. So, I don't know anybody here like that, but mythologists, same thing. I mean, it's almost like not a syndrome, or disorder.
But kind of.
But
But
the infatuation, and you can see this very much, and I think, and the body of work itself is very obsessive and never-ending, repetitive, because you're the same questions being turned over again and again. Whose story is it, and who's going to get out alive, and how are they going to do it?
And these were, what you read from was a rewriting, or translation. What I read from was as well, the fairy tale aspect of it.
Yeah, I was just infatuated with these stories, just their feelings, the sensations of them, and their techniques, the abstraction, the beauty and the terror, how that was translated on the screen and books.
I'm curious, as women who are fascinated with fairy tales and read fairy tales and have kind of made a life of looking at fairy tales, but how do you see fairy tales in the world? Like true stories that seem to mimic fairy tales. Are you finding anything because of your study?
Yeah, I teach a very large introduction to fairy tales class to undergraduates at the University of Arizona. This semester I have 159 students, and a lot of them sign up for the class because the word, the phrase fairy tales, it's one of the, as they say in the environmental movement, it's a charismatic animal. It's like the panda of the literature department, right? It's like fairy tales. And they come to class and they have some idea of what a fairy tale is, but then we go back to like the story of grandmother, which is a little like Riding Hood variation where the girl takes off all of her clothes and then runs through the woods naked at the end. Or you look at the juniper tree where they, eat a boy and And he comes back to life and he becomes himself, basically. But I start talking about fairy tales history, and the lights start going on in the students when they're just reading the newspaper. I mean, you might read about some children who were, say, found locked in a house, kept captive. The abuses in fairy tales are part of, sadly, everyday life and probably many of my students' lives. So they relate intrinsically to the stories of abuses of power. Who's less powerful than a very small child with any adult, and then how many adults abuse that power? So we're all former children in that room, but they start bringing in stories from the news and say, oh, this is just like a fairy tale. And so I think of fairy tales as very realist stories in the best sense of the word real. I mean, they're real stories of survival, real stories of radical resistance to abuses of power. And unfortunately, you don't have to do very much besides walk out your door, if you're lucky, that is, leave your own house to see this happening, sometimes right in your very walls.
And bestiary seems like it's all of what Kate has just described.
Yes.
There's kinds of in fragments and pieces. I love the way the two of you have a unique relationship. And I think it's worth exploring. Can you say like how you know each other? And I was fascinated that in the book Unfinished that you finished one of Kate's stories and then
Yes, but then it turns out that Kate published my second book. In the most magical way, my life is a fairy tale. It really is. One day I got an email from I opened up my Gmail and there was an email from Kate Bernheimer. I was like, what? And she said, Lily, will you let me publish your book? And I said, this is unreal. And so we've had this wonderful relationship since then.
Yeah, that was Lily's second book called Changing, and it won the Pen Beyond Margins Award, which is a really wonderful award. I think it's called something different now.
Open Books.
Open Books Award, and it's specifically, I think the subtitle is for writers of color.
Yeah.
But that was a big deal because my press that I published it under the auspices of Fairy Tale Review Press was basically me in my nightgown, putting books in envelopes and sending them to people. No budget to speak of, just a lot of like fake.
I think it was one of the free contests.
It's not free.
It's not?
Oh no,
Oh
it's
my
hundreds of dollars. But they waived it because my budget, they said, well, is your operating budget less than $1 million a year? And I'm like, well, yes, it is. So they waived the fee. It's
wow.
But the tradition of fairy tales is one of complete collaboration, like all art forms. It's like a seance of thousands of years, but you do what you do because others help you do it, and it's the ultimate collaboration. Fairy tales, I wouldn't even ever have gotten to read fairy tales if there hadn't been editors, translators, book printers, and I think that editorial work is so aligned to the art form of fairy tales. The Brothers Grimm, they're like characters in a fairy tale themselves, brothers as authors.
Yeah.
But one of them was a scholar, one of them was a poet, and there you go, 4 years of painstaking writing, and we have a great tradition to thank because they really popularized it. But editors and editorial work, it's really undervalued, I think, because what we do is it's all working. We can only do it because of each other. So I value and cherish friendships with the artists and others and their supporters.
you have so many fans here that I thought maybe we could open it up to some questions. Yes.
So the question, it came to me when Lily was talking about the Chinese soap operas, and which is are the fairy tales that you work with, is that a universe that's mostly like European-based fairy tales, or is it also Asian and African? Oh, I'm sorry. Is it broader than the European-based fairy tales?
That I work with?
Yeah, well, each of you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I teach and also when I work from tales all around the world. I mean, the Grimms can be credited with popularizing fairy tales in a certain way. They also ended up marginalized, but that helped protect them. It's a different story. But their book was translated into hundreds of languages and outsold the Bible and still does. It sort of keeps pace with the Diary of a Young Girl. The Bible and fairy tales, and they're like variations on the same book in my opinion. But because of the Grimms, we ended up with so many other translations into English and folklore as this area of study. I work myself and teach from stories from all around the world. Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Egyptian, I mean, you name it, I try to read it. Unfortunately, not that much ends up translated into English. And I only read, you know, it's my failure, but I try to read as much as I can get my hands on, and we need more translators, we need to support our translators. But there are millions of fairy tales around the world that will never get translated into any language, and the languages are dying. It's just a tragedy. They're actually archives, they're like locked in archives, like Princess of the Tower. So. But I work all around the world, and I'm really interested in seeing the aesthetic overlaps, compositional, aesthetic, other overlaps, because nobody really knows why these stories exist in variations all around the world. Why do we have Little Red Riding Hood in almost any region? In any language. So why is the pattern the same? Is it because of the way our brains learn language? Some neuroscientists are studying this. Is it because of we're wired for story? Is it, what is it? It's fascinating. And you work. I work all over. Yeah. Russian, ballet, tales.
Yes.
You're working from?
No, I didn't go to Russia.
Okay.
It turns out you need a visa to go to Russia. I was just making myself sound really stupid right now. I'm like, did you know that you border Canada? But yes, I work from all over, but it was only within maybe the last year that I realized that the genesis of my love of fairy tales came from these soap operas. I come to these epiphanies very late in my existence.
It's not late. It's just when it happens. But when it comes to internationality, one of the things I love to do with my students is, they gather fairy tales from family members, and I have students from all over the place, and they record them. They get people in any language, and we listen to them in all languages without translations, and you can understand a fairy tale from its sound. It's really a cool process.
I got this idea. In particular, I wanted to ask you this one question. You had in the forum, The Strange, Beautiful Subterranean Power of Fairy Tales. J.R.R. Tolkien, you talk about the coining of the phrase eucatastrophe for sublime consolations, a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief, and fairy tales are not simplistic, and fairy tales endings do not deny sadness. And you also said fairy tales cannot be strictly defined. They are possibility spaces. And I was thinking when Lydia Yuknovich describes Liza Bestiary as the most perfect use of fragmentation, myth, language, fairy tale, and terrible beauty that I've ever seen in my life. And I wanted to, might you both speak to that idea of eucatastrophe? And I love that idea of possibility spaces in your own work.
I am really obsessed with the sublime, the romantic sublime, especially in fairy tales. And so I'm not sure how that has to do with anything other than I wanted to say I really like the sublime in fairy tales. That precarious space between beauty and this thing really wants to kill you is just so wonderful. Like the woods and the ocean. I really dislike the ocean. Because it can kill you. It wants to kill you, in fact. It's aiming to.
It's a fleeting glimpse of joy, and then
Tsunami.
Yes, you feel me. I understand. Thank you. Yes. But Kate, you want to respond more fully?
Well, I'm interested in what you're saying, because I do think of fairy tales so much in terms of that encounter with the otherness, the other who may, want to kill you or eat you. And there's something there's a very sensual pleasure and fear attached to that. I mean, how many children do you know love to be chased around by somebody saying, I'm going to eat you up, right? I'm going to eat you up. Children delight in that. But in Little Red Riding Hood, I'm going to eat you up isn't an idle threat, right? Or a joke. It actually happens. And I love how in the essay you read, like there's the slime, and then right when you come out of the bottom of the belly, they're covered. But when you read a lot of variations of Little Red Riding Hood, you come out of the belly, you're not dirty at all. You're completely disclosed and clean,
And
whole, not chewed up, nothing gross about it. But that's sort of a part of the catastrophe, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. So before the happy ending of the fairy tale, which may just be coming out of the belly alive, but usually not getting reunited with the mother at the end, or in the Perrault's version of the 17th century, the story just ends with the grandmother and the girl in the belly.
Yeah.
It has a lovely poetic ending that's not happy. But there's this terrible thing that happens, some terrible tragedy, some terrible violation, generally speaking, and then the world continues ever after, right? So there's this one certainty, death, but there's the beauty and light on the other side. And it sort of like that phrase, catastrophe, you saw it as a necessary corollary to tragedy. Then you have the tragedy, and then you have the happy ending, and that they're the same in a certain way.
Yeah, they're just an ending. Sorry, an ending. One of the variations on the Three Little Bears that I love is Old Silverhair, where she's not a little girl, but an old woman with silver hair who is stalking pretty much this family of bears. and then at the end, the three bears come home, and she just jumps out the window. And that's it. No, she did. That's the ending. She jumps out the window, and you don't know if she even survives the jump out the window or what happens next. But it's an ending that is really satisfying.
Because it's joy beyond the walls of the world. She's beyond the walls, right? I mean, she's catapulted herself into a different space.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's really all you need to know. What you get in the fairy tale is really all you need to know to get out of it.
I think we might have time for,
Yeah, I'm really interested in the use of repetition in fairy tales, and I'm interested, in each of the pieces that you wrote, there was, at least one really heavy instance of repetition through the content. You could talk about that, how you use it, how you see it.
I like numbers and things happen in threes. And that's basically it.
But, look at the history of fairy tales. It's interesting, like their lineage and orality and in mythology, the recitation. So often, when fairy tales migrated from the hearth side into books and into the bedrooms and the libraries, when they were hearth side, oftentimes they were the only thing to keep you company in the cold fear of dangerous night. And so there was a pressure to stay up a long time and to keep telling a story, because then somebody was awake and alert and could protect you. So there's orality, and then there's oral. There are vestiges in the literary versions that we have in book version, book tales. I think that it comes from orality, but it also comes from parlor games in the 18th century, so where you would tell a highly embellished, these were very, dignified society members who would gather in salons in France and tell stories, and one of the ways you won, sort of like a competition, was to tell the longest story. And so you just would sort of keep adding ribbons, like it was a story as couture, like how many beads are too many beads, never too many beads. Right? So it's just that was part of the competition. I would love a reality television show that was all around storytelling and that kind of thing. So I think there's lineage in that. And then there's pleasure in repetition. If you like something, if you think of a child again and again, I think that there's just I think there's pleasure in it. And I'm just a person who, if I like something, it's solid for months. I'll see real for weeks until I'm tired of it. Or I have the same record on my record player for around 6 months. Tales.
No.
Clash. If anybody wants to know, but I just play it over and over. It's a long time. And fairy tales are like that. It's just like you just hit repeat, start again, hit repeat. It's a little bit different every time. It's like a little bit different. It can always be. So I think repetition plays in some ways.
Oh, and then, real quick, sorry. When I teach, I say once is an accident, twice is a coincidence, 3 times is a pattern.
Say it again.
Once is an accident, right? If you do it once, it's an accident. If you do it twice, it's a coincidence. If you do it 3 times, it's a pattern.
So that's like a variation on fool you once, shame. Fool
Yes.
me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Fool me thrice.
Fool me thrice, like that's my life. But it is a learning. It's also, I think it's mnemonic. If you hear it, it comes from pedagogy. That's
Well,
what
then,
I'm
we're also in cautionary tales, so we teach them to children who
Right, you just say it
child.
again.
Can I say something about that? When Kroger, called it was and gathering stories from neighbors, one of the things that was omitted and was problematic was the repetition in stories that neighbors told. And the problem was, if you told it once, you didn't have to pay attention. If you told it twice, you had to pay attention. If you told it 3 times, it was ominous. And if you told it the 4th time, it was spiritual.
Oh, there's a 4th time.
There's something about that in the introduction to Zora Neale Hurston's great collection of American tales. She drove around in her car during WPA, and there are variations of stories in there, multiple versions of the same story.
The 4th time rule is the sacred number. So when it's repeated 4 times, you have to pay attention. So some of those stories were gutted because we don't know what was repeated. Kind of interesting. I wonder, in old fairy tales and in the old classic stories, if that might be true as well. There might be some number that takes you into the next world, that pushes you into joy. Or
Absolutely. I think that 12 are
Yeah. This has 12 chapters, by the way, which is a multiple of 3 and 4. Towards children? I think this was one of my happier fairy tales, where, people die and you crawl into a tiger's mouth.
Kate Bernheimer in her perusal of fairy tales from all over different lands, we talk about genotypes sometimes, and I'm very interested to know if you find that fairy tales, many of them, tend to be universal in their origin, or do you find that they have their origin sometimes in specific cultures with migration routes? And just, is one pattern predominant or
There's a lot of discussion about that among scholars, and the great things that there's no definitive answer to your question, and there are a lot of different answers to it. You can look at the interpretation of tales for some answers. So somebody like Eric Fromm would say, well, yeah, what's in common is they're all in the symbolic language. And I see fairy tales themselves as a kind of language, not necessarily symbolic language, but a universal sort of the Joseph Campbell / Debra Magpie Jungian approach. There's some universals, fears, phobias, dreads, desires that they're tapped into that. But you can also trace them to specific examples. So if you look at Little Red Riding Hood in parts of Italy, there might be pasta featured, or there might be dumplings featured, or when you take it on to Russia, you might have a knish, or and so you can trace a variation or a version of a tale to a particular time, place, maybe a teller, maybe an addition, and see what the influences were. But how it got, the how, what, where, why, when, you don't know the answers to it. There are many answers, many answers.
So it's possible, yes.
Yes.
I mean, if you look at Little Red alone, right, that their Little Red is scattered all around the world from different times and places. And the orality of fairy tales makes it impossible, like Kate said. Have a definitive answer, but yes, I think that that's a very possible scenario.
I was thinking of something like the Bluebeard legend, which I've often thought of being Middle Eastern and somehow connected with Shamanism. And yet I know it also has origins in ancient France. And, I can't say any more than that, but it's and then there's some things that we're going to make a professional way. And Scandinavian and so many different things.
And nobody knows, and scholars don't agree, and folklorists do incredible work excavating the sources of the tales and why they're where they are, when they are, and that excavation. I mean, folklorists are the saints, and the folklore departments are getting decimated left and right around this country. It's really tragic. But nobody really knows. I think that's part of the beauty. And I'm really interested in